Thank you very much. Okay. I think we are good to start, unless we're waiting for anybody, Catherine.
No, not really. Elaine
Right.
couldn't do the morning. She's got a client meeting, so we can just pass it on to her.
All right. Okay. So thank you so much for coming in. And I know there was a last minute change with the time. So thank you very, very much for being able to make it. I did have a diary clash and I was called upon to do something, to present on something which is time sensitive. So I couldn't turn it down. But this roundtable came about from one of our previous meetings where I found that, Q&As were really quite popular. Everybody was really interested in sort of rolling their sleeves up and answering questions on things which sometimes we just don't have the law in writing, or there aren't enough case studies as yet. So it's lovely to have you here, and I see some new faces. Angie, welcome again. Not seen you around, so it's good to see you here. I'm Sandhya Iyer, for those of you who don't know me. Ben, I've connected with you on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I happen to be on the board of the Sevenoaks Chamber of Commerce, and my business obviously is HR department. So feel free to introduce yourselves as we go around, with your questions. And it's going to be a fairly informal event. So please, I'm assuming everyone has a question there, and we just chip in as and when. So who'd like to go first? Angie, since we haven't seen you in a long time, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I think the sort of question or topic that I just would be interested to know what others are doing on is a lot of people, or certainly a lot of my clients now, I should probably say who I am. So I work at Thomas Mansfield. I'm an employment lawyer, and we have an office in Tunbridge Wells. I predominantly work in the London office, which we've just gone back to finally, which has been really nice. So I'm seeing a lot of clients asking for advice on going back to work and what to allow in terms of hybrid working and that sort of thing. And I'd just be interested to know what other people's thoughts are and how you're trying to sort of steer your clients. I'm sort of torn between, I think everyone's realised that some working from home is possible, but I also don't want my clients to agree to things now that they'll come to regret in a few years' time, when either it's fine when you've got a current team and everyone knows each other and knows what they're doing, but I can see dangers down the line when people need to be trained. There's a loss of skill or knowledge of just this absorption of knowledge that I think most people learn from, anyone learns from, and just how you're trying to stop them from getting carried away with allowing everyone to have the most flexible pattern in the world, because it might come back to bite them later.
So if I was to summarize that, Angie, are you looking for what best practice is being adopted by sort of most of us around our clients when it comes to either working from the office or flexible working arrangements?
Yeah, or really what
longer term approach in mind.
Sort of what your clients, the people that you're working with, what their feeling is towards allowing it, and if anyone else feels like they might be getting carried away with just allowing too much and then setting themselves up for problems in the future, and how you're trying to rein them in from committing to anything too soon.
I think what a lot of my clients are saying, and I think it's really kind of interesting point, Angie, but there's another layer to all of this, which is the phenomenon that's the great kind of resignation. And with these statistics, 30% of people are looking for other jobs. And what a lot of my clients are saying is, unless they get the hybrid working pattern right and what they want, what their staff want, it's very much a candidate market. You're going to lose a big subset of your workforce. And then you'll be left with recruiting people. So unless you're kind of agile and have the right supervision in place and the right integration so that people do feel like they're part of the workforce, particularly like you say, Angie, those new starters. You know, I've met people recently that have been with the business for a year, and I've only met them, you know, once or twice and seen them on Zoom plenty of other times, and it just isn't the same. So it is a really kind of difficult concept, because you're trying to future-proof people's businesses in the advice that we're sort of giving our commercial clients, and on top of that, we've got this sort of market trend, or sort of, you know, national trend actually, that all sectors are being affected by people wanting to move jobs more so than ever. Plus, there's all these vacancies, so it's very much being driven by what a lot of our clients' staff want, as opposed to what they want. So I think that, to some extent, for my clients, we're sort of navigating that. You know, it's different from different sectors. I do lots of work in construction, and, you know, frankly, they hardly stopped in the pandemic, and hardly stopped in the pandemic, other than, you know, downturns in work. But the office workers, it's about having the kind of the health and safety in place, responding to kind of what's going on in the environment. So when you see kind of peaks, you give people the opportunity to sort of pull back and work from home. But I think beyond that, it's the hybrid working approach, isn't it? For what certainly what most of my clients are asking for is that they, you know, they want those policies and the supervision in place, and the integration sort of ideas to keep everybody in the business rather than leaving.
I think also adding to that, Emma, getting those policies in place is a really big thing at the moment. I mean, I don't know about you, but most clients that I've spoken to haven't yet got their policies and documentation in place to be able to fall back on those as rules as to what their employees should be doing. And so employees are still very much a case of, well, I might work from home today, or I might come into the office today, and there's no sort of set rules as to what they're doing. And I think getting those rules in place, it's been almost 2 years now, and I think there are still so many of my clients that don't have those policies in place that use as a guideline for their employees. And so getting those in place, I think, is really number one priority, to then be able to use it as a rule to say, well, yeah, okay, we're happy for you to work from home 2 to 3 days a week, or whatever that might be, but I think it's really important to be coming in, to be integrating in with your workplace, not just your colleagues, but colleagues in other departments, or however your workplace is set up, just to get people talking again, because it's a lonely place working from home.
Yeah, it is. One of the tricky areas, like saying about the rules as well, again, some of them are looking at that, and it's those rules around what a couple of them have mentioned is a particular problem, say sort of 4 o'clock onwards, when if they're working from home, their children do come home from school, and then the children in the background, and really they're saying, well, the time for that's gone now, because actually we're talking about confidential matters. We don't want people in the background, whether it's the person's husband or children or whatever. But trying to, you know, it seems that people feel that's unreasonable. So you can't be, you know, have the children in the house with you interrupting and walking past the camera, etc., when you're actually supposed to be working. And how do you get some assurances on that? I don't know if any of you have got any particular thoughts on that tricky topic.
Yeah, most of my clients are smaller businesses in the financial sector. Sorry, excuse me for the fuzzy. I don't quite know why I've got a fuzzy video. Most of my clients are small firms in the financial sector, and I think, Angie, they quite a lot of them 3 or 4 months ago were having the same issues, but the ones who, from talking to them, have ended up becoming more successful at managing this, have taken a relatively blunt line and said, either they've said, right, X days a week, everyone's in, and Friday's flexible, or Monday's flexible, or whatever. But they've been a lot more definitive about it, and they've also said the reality is that we got through the lockdowns despite the distance, not because of the distance. And I think there is an unspoken issue that companies are not saying, but reflected a comment piece in the FT about a month ago. And one of the journalists said, if you're I'll pick an age, but obviously we can't mention age. If you're a 25 to 34-year-old new employee in a business, probably junior, maybe one level up, the best thing you can do is be the exception amongst your peer group and be in the office 5 days a week, because every company will tell you they're not going to discriminate on promotion and opportunities based on who's there every day. It's absolute rubbish. If you're there 5 days a week, on average, you will get more opportunities, more development, more advancement by being there every day. And companies are avoiding saying that because it doesn't fit with the hiring model, but it's absolutely true. So some of my clients have said to people, we will be flexible, but be realistic. If you're not here, you are not going to, especially for the juniors, you are not going to learn as much. So, and we will factor that in, because if you're not, if for some reason you're one of those miracle people that manages to learn everything being in the office 2 days a week, fantastic. But you may not want to take that risk.
Yeah.
I've, with our clients, what we've done, just to carry on the same thread of what Mike just said, we have taken a similar sort of blunt approach with some of the businesses. And the determining factor there has been the needs of the business. Like in the example that you just quoted, if you're discussing confidential information, that is a reasonable enough explanation to state why on specific days, you are required to be in the office, so that those matters can be attended to when you're in the office. So we have kind of, where we've taken a blunt, we've sort of adopted that blunt line, that blunt approach, and said Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or, whether it's 3 days a week or 4 days a week, however it might be, there is a very clear business rationale backing that up. Say, this is why we need you in the office for 2 to 3 days. And keeping that at the crux of that discussion tends to give business owners the necessary tools to steer that discussion without leaving staff feeling like their views just don't matter. Because what we are then trying to achieve there is that balance between what the staff member requires and what the business requires. So I'm just trying to condense that into just, to say this is what we put at the crux of that discussion, which is really the operational needs, the business needs, and then work with staff needs around that. Because ultimately you're here because of the business. And one of my clients was very clear, saying, if we don't put the business in the middle of these discussions, and he put it quite nicely, he said, there will be no business to run and you will just not have a job at the end of it. And we don't want that. We really want to retain all of you and get the best out of you, but equally the business needs this. And that seemed to hit home.
Yeah.
If that's of, any help.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? I think there's been, what I've seen amongst some people is an almost backlash against this sort of flexible working. So we've been putting up with it for so long, we've been making it work, and then people at the top of the business saying, we just can't manage like this anymore. We need people in, etc. But that's at odds with what people who are working in the business want. Actually, they want more balance. They want to be able to work from home more. They want to be able to, have a flexible model and work in a hybrid way, as you were saying, Emma. And I think it is absolutely going to depend on the nature of the job, the nature of the company that you're working in, and what your setup is at home. If you've got an office at the bottom of the garden and you can do everything confidentially, and you're in that fortunate position, then that's great. I mean, obviously dealing with confidential information with clients all the time. I haven't done anything face-to-face in terms of being required to work face-to-face for at least 18 months, if not longer, 2 years probably. And that's worked, but for other organizations, that's not going to be the same. And I think it's about employers having honest conversations with their employees to say, this is what works for us, this isn't, and being clear about what the rationale for that is, not just, coming across as sort of overly draconian or grumpy, that we just had enough this working from home culture, because it's not what we had when we were at your age or your stage of career. I don't, that's enough.
I think one of the other tricky areas is the fact that in looking at, okay, who does home working work for? It's evident that the sort of more junior jobs, like the administrator type jobs, are less suitable for home working. So then you get this dual workforce where the senior people who've all got, you know, nice office at home or whatever, they seem to be given more flexibility. But it is role specific, because they aren't doing the post and the copying and the admin and, you know, getting bundles together for people and getting, you know, packs of stuff together for people. They're not doing that so much, and they've made it work while they've worked from home, but it isn't as efficient as them being there and just working through it. So I think that's another factor that, you know, in conveying the message, that it really is role specific, because otherwise you'll look at an organization and think, well, hang on, all the juniors are being made to come in every day. That's not really fair. All the seniors are allowed to just do what they want and be at home most of the week. And that's, I think, that the sort of managers are finding it difficult to really justify that. And so, but the seniors saying, well, I don't need to come in. Well, no, that's true, but we sort of need a bit of you coming in, because otherwise you've got to lead by example and be there for the others.
I almost see it as sort of as having kind of three levels to it, which is, does it work for us as a company, given the nature of what we do? Does it work for us as a team or for your role? And then does it work for you as an individual? Because what's your setup? You know, are we happy with the kind of performance levels that we're getting when people work from home? You know, I remember sort of my team when I was working in the city in 2016. I had someone that worked from home 4 days a week, you know, way before pandemic or anything like that. And she was by far the highest performer in the team. But her job was systems based. So she was always available to answer queries, but she was working on the system. So it worked perfectly for her being at home, but that wouldn't necessarily be the case for everyone else. So that's the kind of way that I've been looking at it, is company, team or role, individual, and then making an assessment based on that.
And I think whatever's implemented by the client, I'm saying it has to be a cultural change. You can't put culture on a piece of paper. So you can't say, you know, picking up on the point we've just made, you know, you can't say, look, we embrace hybrid working, but anybody that hybrid works doesn't ever get promoted again, because culturally that won't work and people will leave and you'll lose people that require that flexibility. I did a survey with one of our big recruiters, and so it's a survey of the legal market, and legal candidates are number one across all age ranges. Their priority isn't money, it's flexibility. It's flexibility in terms of working, and the highest proportion of people wanted to do hybrid working, and then there's a far lower percentage of people that wanted to work fully in the office and fully at home. So very few people want to work entirely remotely. So what that, for the legal industry at least, what that means is you've got to properly embrace hybrid working, you've got to get on top of supervision, you've got to get on top of making sure people are properly integrated in the days that they're in the office. And actually, for us as a business, we're saying we want people to come back to work. We want to get people back into the office, because that's when you share ideas. That's when, you know, the culture of the business, which for me, I think is just inherent, and it's really, really important in the success of my business. That's when you get that. So we've almost got to kind of entice people back into wanting to be in their workplace, whilst making sure it works for them, or they'll leave and they'll go somewhere else that does, you know, what they want to do. And it sounds very much like I'm allowing the employees to drive what they want, and absolutely, but that's for our industry, our employees deliver the service to our clients, and if they're not happy, everything else kind of around that falls apart. So it's just a really tricky balance, but I think culture is so much more than a policy.
It's also so ingrained in the way that we work. So we've had 18 months of this, or 2 years of this sort of different way of working that is still bedding in, and people are still getting used to, and they don't really know the full impact of positive and negative. that it has, where we've had however many decades of this system where everyone traipses into this building at the same time every day and leaves at the same time every day, and we've got into that way of thinking. That's how you work. That's you turn up, you have meetings, you meet at the coffee point. That's how everyone works. We've only had a really short period of time for that to have all been undone suddenly, and so I think there's a lot of stuff that we don't even realize yet that impacts positive and negative of working in this way.
I'm
Sorry,
sure.
I just think, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to say, I think we just need to, Angie, I think we've answered that question.
Yeah, no, it's useful.
I think we need to move on to the next question. Is just because I like us to flush out as many questions as we can during this roundtable. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Chris, did you have any questions at all? We haven't heard from you at all during this meeting.
I don't have a particular question as such. I was, if I might just go back to that previous question that Andrew raised. I think I would endorse everything that has been shared. I think it's very well articulated, and there are those frictions. It's all very well being aspirational, but the recognition, I think, on the part of employers is that balance has shifted. And as Ben was saying, the idea 9 to 5, and that's it. And, it's almost a disciplinary if you can't stick to that, has altered, and that's been seismic. And I think there has to be that recognition in how you address that, because I think that power balance has changed, and that's what's driving the hybrid situation. One thing that I was just going to add to the conversation, though, was this idea that sometimes when you have senior people working from home and they're no longer, they're clearly representing the organization, but actually their individual status is enhanced and their relationship with the client is sort of pushed up a degree. And therefore, actually, when you're looking at policies and so forth, actually bear in mind the restrictive covenants that go with things, because to some extent you've lost a degree of overarching control with senior people, and actually putting a great deal of trust, because they really are not just front office now, they're the entire office, they're entirely representative of your organization. And sometimes that increased distance makes an employer more vulnerable, and particularly when people are beginning to put together a shopping list of what they want from their employment and what benefits they think are an equal share. So that again is an unusual one, I think, to sort of bolt on to the way employers are approaching these things. But in terms, sorry, to answer your question as to whether I had a question, I didn't as such. I was just going to mention, it's not a question as such, but I was a couple of days ago trying to introduce a menopause policy to somebody at work. Sorry, not here, obviously, but at client's work. And the degree of resistance I got to it was quite startling. And what really knocked me back was the blokes figuratively around the table nodded and sort of thought, right, this is a bit of a, okay, we appreciate this is very much in vogue, this is very happening. Oh my goodness, it's a sort of policy they sort of did the sort of, okay, fine, well, let's just nod it through because, we dare not come up with anything. And I've had two females push back and really be quite agitated about it. And it was quite interesting because my perception was that it would be a bit of a shoo-in. And I thought it was something that was, very collegiate and very cooperative. And I was really taken aback by the suggestion that it was unnecessary, inappropriate, overstepping the mark and actually unwelcome. I didn't.
Interesting. How old were they? The ladies that objected?
I would have said, if we're talking between perhaps 45 and 55, I'm not very good with ages, to be honest, but I would have put them squarely in that. And I was really rather taken aback. I mean, it was.
That's surprising, yeah.
It was. I mean, it was thrown in my face that it was yeah, and just unnecessary. And I you know, and we had quite a developing argument, well, sort of conversation. There was no real friction, but and I was suggesting, well, at the very least, it's raising a subject, and it's designed to facilitate an exchange of information, so it's not taboo and all the rest of it. I was completely running into a brick wall, and I just didn't know if anybody else had similar experiences, or if I was just unlucky in that particular instance.
Emma, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm kind of just interested to know what makes them think it's kind of unnecessary, because it's almost a bit like saying, you know, you're not going to recognise people that use a wheelchair because it's unnecessary. Is it they think it was unnecessary to them, given that it's a fairly recognised concept and the impact it's having on people in the workplace? What exactly was the problem?
I think their concern was actually about flexible working, but I don't think they would tell me that. I think they were intransigent, and what they were concerned about was the policy. I mean, they said the policy could be abused, to which I said, yes, any policy can be abused.
Any policy could be, yeah.
And you approach it in a sensible and cooperative manner. But if you think it's susceptible to abuse and it's being, you know, taken for granted or, you know, overextended, then you rein it in, and you look at individuals who, you know, in the usual way, as with any policy. I don't think that's a good reason not to introduce a policy. You know, thank you, but let's move on. And no, let's go back. And I think the overarching concern was one of, we don't want to introduce flexible working and give it a right in the policy via the back door. I'm pretty certain that's what it was about, but they wouldn't tell me that.
Where we've introduced that policy, Chris, there hasn't been any resistance, so to speak. At least I haven't come across. I don't know whether Mike or Sarah have come across anything, but the debate, so to speak, has been, you know, around. I was also listening to a podcast which said, there aren't enough case laws. This is a top barrister was talking about, who specializes in just menopause claims, related claims, and there apparently aren't enough case laws. There's clearly no written law around which side of the line menopause should be treated as. So the question is whether it should be treated as a disability. And if you treat it as a disability, then the pros are that you can make adjustments at work. But the con is almost sort of, it's almost like it's not a disability, because, you know, it is just a hormonal change that is going to trigger this for a certain period of time. So would that be the right way to go? Or should it be where somebody is not being, you know, where certain adjustments are not being made for menopause, and then the employee finally, you know, claims constructive dismissal? Should that be coupled with a gender specific discrimination? So should it be gender, or should it be disability? So that has been the debate when trying to address anything related to menopause, but definitely there has been no pushback on introducing a policy. If anything, it has been welcomed. But is there clarity on, you know, what is the risk, on whether it's a disability related risk, you know, should there be a constructive dismissal claim, or a gender specific one? That is the one that's being debated right now. Else come, I mean, you know, whether Mike, Sarah, Angie, and Ben, if you've got input on.
I think you might have been unlucky, Chris.
Yeah.
I haven't experienced any, only a couple, I would say, that have said, oh, you know, we've seen a lot about this, that we think we should probably have one. But haven't, one was a sort of female CEO that put it in place, another, you know, I haven't heard any sort of pushback about it. So perhaps you've just been unlucky there.
I wonder whether the pushback was merely a, oh, these blooming employment lawyers always just want us to put another policy in place. But in terms of whether or not it's more likely to be gender or disability in terms of discrimination, and with that being the debate that's being had at the moment within. I mean, I haven't had any cases myself on it at all yet, but I think I would be pushing more for it to be a gender discrimination rather than disability, just because of the hurdle of the 12 months or more for trying to get effect, because it's not something that they're going to be living with forever. Although do have it for longer than others. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously arguments either way, but I think I would definitely be pushing for gender rather than disability if I was arguing it on behalf of the client.
Interesting. There was this, it was basically a podcast between two barristers, top barristers, and one of them was stating, the barrister who was specifically focusing on menopause as an issue was saying it should be gender specific, whereas the other barrister was saying it should be disability because that allows a business more leeway to make adjustments. So who knows where this is going to go? But yeah, it was just an interesting conversation to be a part of.
Don't you think? I think it's a very. I'm sorry, when I dropped off, so I missed the first bit. Chris, were you saying it was an issue within your firm or within a client?
Oh no. It was a client scenario, right. And I was propositioning it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know other people's experience, but I tend to think that there are certain, for smaller businesses, policies are almost a secondary discussion. It's just about how you want to conduct the business. Whereas, you know, if you're in a larger firm where it's bigger than, frankly, everyone in one room, then you probably need some sort of policy just to have a baseline to make sure that people aren't interpreting flexible approaches in an inconsistent way. But the menopause thing, I think, has been very interesting. I mean, again, small firms in the financial sector, big surprise, not many females of that age. But I'm tending to think that this is one of those things where there will be a small group of people who will be, you know, manning the ramparts and say, oh my God, this is just another thing, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, that I'm sort of discounting that. I think it's mainly down to, in my experience, most smaller firms or most small to medium-sized firms tend to try and do what they can to accommodate personal situations, be whatever they are. And I think policies tend to be secondary to it, but I think it's worth, as I think Sanjay said, it's worth having the consideration up front so that if it's raised, it isn't suddenly a shock horror look of rabbit in headlights. I don't know if that makes.
Yeah, great. And I think and I say to my commercial clients, I'm putting any policy in place, it's like, you know, things come to me later today, so quite often we're in the tribunal. The first my clients, what's your policy on it? And they, you know, if you say, oh, I'm always flexible on these things, but the great thing is when they go, yeah, I've got this policy, you get up in the tribunal and you say, look, then my client takes this so seriously that they put a policy in place dealing with that. So again, it's all about culture. And Mike's absolutely right that most people deal with it, you know, personally before putting anything in writing. But a lawyer loves a policy because you get up and you say, look, my client is an equal opportunities employer. Here's our policy. So this is our starting point. And that's kind of the way you sell it to your clients, isn't it? In that this is the issue of the menopause, how that's affecting people and their performance at work. That is it's a hot topic. Do you want to pretend like it's not happening? Do you want to put a policy in place that supports your managers and helps guide everybody in the business in dealing and addressing these issues? If they arise, when they arise, everybody feels comfortable with it. And those employers that say, look, this is just another policy, you're cross-selling me, you say, that's absolutely fine. It's absolutely your decision.
Yeah. So certainly, I was just going to answer the point, Sanjay, about whether it's discrimination or disability. I think the tribunals are sort of wrestling with this concept, and you're seeing already cases being appealed successfully because the tribunal have not applied the right test. So let's assume that the judiciary are somewhat thrown by this or capable of getting it wrong. From an employee point of view, why would you not shotgun it? I mean, you'd start off with it's a contractual matter because it's a breach of trust and confidence. It's potentially constructive dismissal. You'd look at perhaps protected disclosure and whistleblowing because you're saying this is a legal matter and you're not addressing it. And then you'd say, and it is either or disability or discrimination. And, you know, you put the pressure on the employer to say, oh, right, okay, we've got a full load here to deal with. Because why would you narrow your argument? Because if you present an argument that's on the wrong footing, you restrict yourself quite artificially. And certainly I've encountered that scenario where an employer has to deal with everything because literally everything and the kitchen sink is being thrown in. And why not from an employer's perspective? But it shows the context as to why it's so important to get it right, because you can trip up on any one of these points, which, you know, even if it's not necessarily a discriminatory matter, could still be an unfair, constructive unfair dismissal, you know, via the back door almost. And so, you know, by hook or by crook, you've got to take these things seriously.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's really, that's a very valid point. So, yeah, Chris, you always come up with these really good sort of, you know, the way you close off a discussion. I just love it. It's really interesting.
I've probably been speaking for too long. I'll shut up for a bit. Shall I let somebody else get a word in?
No, because I do remember a couple of meetings ago when we had the discussion around appeals with redundancies, and I recollect you closing it off really nicely. So thank you for that. It's good. Anybody else has any other input on that? If I may, I don't know whether Emma's got any questions or Mike. Anyone's got any questions?
Yeah, I've got one if I can pitch in.
You go ahead.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, most of my clients are small businesses in the financial sector. I've got a couple of professional services or fintech or software, but generally small. I'm just wondering, for anyone that has clients in that sort of space, I get quite a lot of sort of ad hoc discussions around diversity and inclusion. And I'm just curious as to what other people do. So generally when occasionally a hedge fund will call me and say, we need a diversity and inclusion policy. Have you got one? And I say, yeah, absolutely, no problem at all. What are you going to do with question 2? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'm assuming you're putting it in place because an investor has said to you, what are you doing about diversity and inclusion? And you've got to tick the box on the due diligence questionnaire. And they said, yes. I said, okay, what are you going to do when they ask you what's behind that and what you're doing about it and all the rest of it? And there's then sort of a stunned silence of and you know, I'm going to say to people, look, I'm very happy to sort something out for you, but I think it's a bit thin and you run a risk of potentially it being worse than not having one at all. And I'm just curious, in that sort of size business, those types of environments, what other people are seeing, and I'm just very curious because I think there's a risk of it all being paper thin.
So are you specifically focusing on those sectors alone, Mike? I mean, is your question specific to that sector?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, in those types of sectors, because I understand that there's a lot of things that are sector specific if you're in retail or hospitality or construction or education or public sector or whatever. But so I'm just curious in the professional services, financial, software, smaller businesses, for anyone that has those types of clients, what they're seeing in that type of space for that type of thing.
Yeah, I've got a couple of clients in that space. One of them I would say is more sort of, I don't know, forward thinking than the other. So actually has a fairly kind of genuine commitment to this sort of in this sort of space, has put training in place, does training for its managers that we've worked on together, and has policies as well. I mean, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I understand I mean, I'm going to speak sort of stereotypically here, but what, you know, when you talk about financial services and professional services, I think it's sort of, you know, it conjures an image, doesn't it, of sort of fairly kind of white middle class male dominated environments.
Yeah.
And is that a fair sort of
Yeah.
summary? And who perhaps aren't aren't as committed to these, they're doing it exactly as you said. It's a tick box exercise to get through some sort of funding hurdle or something like that.
I think most of them are. I mean, I think it's a relatively diverse workforce from an ethnicity and a background and a different country perspective. I think the gender it isn't, and various other characteristics it isn't. But I just don't think a lot of them have ever addressed it. So that's why I was curious as to whether anyone is seeing anything different in those types of spaces.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, with one of my clients, that they're fairly small. So I would say kind of not really small, 50 to 60 staff maybe, but they've grown quite a lot over the last 2 to 3 years. And I think there is a genuine kind of commitment there to say, actually, let's not just kind of carry on as we've always been and just assume there's no issues until we hear there's an issue, but actually do some more work around educating our workforce, giving people an opportunity to speak out about their experiences, because we all know the business rationale for doing that. And I think coming back to Emma's point about the Great Resignation, people just having a lot more choice about the environment that they want to work in and the places they want to work now. So I think it's about, as with anything, it's about attracting and retaining your top talent. So, I think, as I say, I have got clients that get this more than others do. So I don't know if I could categorically say there's a shift in that direction. It's a bit of a 50-50 split at the moment.
Okay.
I think, Mike, from my experience, what we find is small businesses, particularly, their teams are pretty cohesive. They're very closely knit. And sometimes diversity and inclusion is not on the forefront of the business owner's mind or agenda until they have their fingers burned by a bad grievance. And then suddenly, obviously that will then come out in the recommendations of the grievance outcome. And then suddenly that kind of becomes one of their priorities to address. I'm not saying that it's always a reactive approach to including a diversity and inclusion policy. Clients are quite happy to have that. What I'm trying to explain is either because as a result of a grievance, or because they acknowledge that times are changing, there's menopause policies being sort of brought into the into the discussion, for example. It's a bit of both, and it's not necessarily just a tick in the box exercise. So what they tend to do is obviously have they have focus groups where they will discuss something that is a niggle in the business and just bring teams together. There are some clients who do this once a month. Some of my clients will do it once a month. I will sit on the focus groups as well. And then from there, we look at action points. So if you're looking at diversity and inclusion, walking the talk, so to speak, of the policy, then we're almost kind of establishing an audit trail to say this business does take it quite seriously. That's one way in which we approach it.
Okay. Thank you.
That's all right. And anyone else who's got a question?
I had one quick question, Sandy, and I don't know if it's the question that I sort of submitted before. I can't actually remember what that was, right. But it was just around what I'm seeing in my consultancy with just a massive rise of grievances at the moment. So I could almost run my business just on grievance investigations at present. That's all I seem to have on in the last few months. And I don't know whether it's everyone's been storing it up over the last 18 months and now we're back to approaching some sort of normality. The issues that I've been sitting on have now come back to the forefront again. But I just didn't know whether that was other people, whether, again, it's just the nature of my clients, or whether that's been other people's experience recently. You as well, Sam? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Because, and I find that it's ironically, it is the better performing employees who are just bringing up grievances because they just feel like they've been running crazy, trying to do everything. I don't know what Mike or Sarah, what your experience of.
Has there been kind of trend that you're dealing with?
Is there a trend? Good question. I would say so. Some of them are related to redundancy and redundancy processes. So yes, there's an element of that. Others are more to do with management approach and behaviours. Some of them have discrimination angles to them. Others more around kind of bullying and harassment. So yeah, I'd say those are probably the three broad categories that I'm sort of dealing with at the moment.
They're not necessarily just things which might have come about because of the pandemic.
No, that in fact, you know, apart from the ones that are related to redundancy processes, I would say they're almost entirely unrelated on the surface, at least, to the pandemic. Yeah, it's almost like people have been sitting on stuff for a period, you know, that I'll give my employer a bit of leeway because we're having to deal with some exceptional circumstances, but now things are back to some sort of normality. Actually, these issues have come back to the fore again.
Well, grievances, I think it might be the same for capability processes and the other way around. Employers dealing with employees that have been sort of out of sight and out of mind for so long.
Yeah.
I mean, we've certainly felt or noticed a difference in the number of queries we're getting from employer clients in relation to dealing with employees in the workplace, because disciplinary actions or misconduct or capability, poor performance, anything like that hasn't been dealt with in the same way while people have been at home, out of sight and out of mind. So I wonder whether we're going to get an increase in that sort of work as well our way, as and when people start coming back into the office.
I also think it's market driven, as Emma said earlier. I think if it's a candidate market at the moment, and I think people are more emboldened. I mean, I'm the worst person to ask because I'm the least sympathetic HR person ever invented, and I want to just be able to reach across and say, oh, for God's sake, get on with your job, which apparently isn't always the right thing to say. But I think it is very market driven, and from the ones I do see, I think it is. I would say there is a proportion, whether it's large or small, I guess everyone will have a different view. There is a proportion of grievances that have this month's latest phrase, word, theme, topic included within it. But I think it's absolutely what Emma said earlier. I think it's market driven, because, you know, no one was going to be bitching and moaning back in May 2020.
Yeah. Or on nearly full pay.
Yeah. Okay. No, interesting. Thank you.
I'm thinking of lobbying MPs for the ability for every manager to have 5 opportunities per year to be able to lean across the table and say, shut up and get on with your work without any comeback. But I'm not convinced of the success likelihood. I think there'd be some support, but probably not across the board.
We'll surely have support from small business owners.
It'd be like carbon credits. You can buy and sell them between businesses.
I have a question on compulsory jabs in the care sector. If nobody had any other questions, I was looking at the time. Am I all right to introduce that? Okay, so I take that as yes, I can carry on with my question. So this is about so obviously November 11th, anybody working in the care sector should have, you know, a compulsory, should have had 2 jabs. If they've been using the self-certified exemption, then by December 24th, they are required to have got that COVID pass, which confirms that they are actually, which confirms legally that they are medically exempt. Now, there has been some pushback from some of our care workers saying, don't feel the need to get, COVID pass, or we just don't see them acting quick enough. And there is a worry that there is going to have, some heads are going to have to roll. Now, the question here is, with the case, do we go down the route of, you are dismissed because you carry on working is going to be contravention of a specific statute, which is section 98(2)D, I think. Or do we say it's some other substantial reason? There are pros and cons to both. So what would be your take? Would you go down, on what would, how would you go down the route of dismissal? Would it be SOSR or would it be on a statute? And why? If you could just explain that a little bit, please.
I'd probably go down the contravention of statute and some other substantial reason in the alternative, because the tribunal, broadly speaking, doesn't like some other substantial reason, and you're just going to argue that as your kind of fallback. I think the statute provision is, it's in a breach of legislation. There's your. And that's probably, I haven't had to plead it yet. I don't suppose anybody's pleaded it yet, but no, that's the approach that I would take.
I would imagine as well that the deadline is April, isn't it, next year in the statute? So you've got time between now to be notifying your staff, warning them of the consequences if they don't provide this, and show that you've evidenced going through that process before you ultimately end up at a point where you've got to have that dismissal conversation. So, there'd be, I would imagine that I will defer to the lawyers on this, but I would imagine that the tribunal would be sort of saying, well, okay, we're in November now. What was the process between November and April of talking to and engaging with and warning your staff about what they needed to do and what the consequences of not doing it would be?
Yeah, so to your point, Ben, one of the options that are being explored is to say, we will ask you to furnish a COVID pass, which is a reasonable management instruction, because the worry is, care workers, sometimes we find that they just don't take these things seriously enough. The worry is that come December 24th, we go down the route of dismissal, and then they suddenly say, oh, actually, I did have the COVID pass. Because then if we went down the route of contravention, then it becomes an unfair dismissal, because at that time they had the COVID pass, but just that we were not made aware of it. It's a bit like somebody saying, I have dyslexia after they've been dismissed, and appealing it on those grounds. So we are going down the route of saying, or we are thinking about it, saying, should we say, yes, you need to furnish it, put it in writing, so that would be a reasonable management instruction. And finally, if they didn't, submit whatever they had to submit, then we can say it's gross misconduct because you didn't submit it when you were asked to. And taking it down that route, would does that make sense? So that would be more like an SOSR dismissal, because we are first going on the route of saying you need to furnish this paperwork. So that is the process we are trying to follow, because in this case, we don't have a written out process. All we can do is go with guidance to say you have to furnish the COVID pass. So we're going to put it to them in writing to say furnish the COVID pass, which exempts you from the jab, and we're giving you a deadline of 24th of December.
Okay, so this is more would
that be?
Well, it's not more now an employer's policy rather than a legal requirement, isn't it? Because the legal requirement doesn't kick in until, as I understand it, and again, I'll be corrected, but my understanding was it doesn't kick in until April next year, that everyone has to have a COVID pass. Sorry, everyone has to have been fully vaccinated by April next year if they're
not for the care sector. If you're a care worker, come 11th of November, you need to have been vaccinated, or you need to, or until the 11th of November, you could have carried on with a self-certified exemption certificate, which exempted you. After the 11th of November, you only have 12 weeks to furnish a COVID pass. By the end of those 12, you should have a COVID pass to say you are medically exempt. Yeah, some aren't taking that seriously enough. So, yeah, sorry.
The legal question in any dismissal is, well, ultimately it boils down to reasonableness. So you're not going to dismiss somebody with, well, I'd recommend against any of my clients terminating an employment until you've got to the bottom of whether or not they've got the pass or not, or whether or not they've been vaccinated or whatever else. So there's an obligation on the employer to establish that. I personally would be going down a gross misconduct route. I think that's... probably, would another employer dismiss on those grounds? They'd probably rely on the statutory provisions. That's why it's there.
Even after you've been given 12 weeks to furnish the paperwork?
But I think that's just part of the reasonableness of the decision to dismiss. The ultimate decision to dismiss is that they, you know, they're not compliant with the legislation and therefore they can't control. Yeah, I mean, I would recommend a client to go down the gross misconduct route, because I think that's why you've got that potentially fair reason for dismissal there, is for exactly these sorts of circumstances. And like I said, I'd argue some other substantial reason in the alternative. And if you don't feel that they've complied with their obligations to provide the paperwork, you feed that into the SOSR.
So that's why you say SOSR then.
Yeah, this is back. But that's how I'd plead it, and I couldn't imagine a tribunal would criticise that narrative. But I mean, we'll see as cases evolve, you know, how people deal with it. But I imagine the way it will be dealt with.
I have just an interesting query in relation to the same point from an individual who, I mean, she works for a school, and she was talking about this compulsory vaccine potentially coming into schools as well. I mean, I know it's not at the moment, but if it were to, she's currently going through fertility treatment and has done extensive research about the vaccine and fertility research, and has got down to the number of spikes on a neuron. I mean, I'm not scientific, so I'm saying the wrong thing, but she is very anti having the vaccine in case it has a detrimental effect on her fertility treatment. But I don't think that there's enough research yet to show that the vaccine is not recommended for people having that fertility treatment, and so she can't get the medical exemption. So her question is, well, can she be dismissed for not having the vaccine if this compulsory vaccine comes into schools as well? And so I think I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what other people's thoughts were on this, but I think that we would be looking at trying to get across all the hurdles of that research, and her belief being a philosophical belief that the vaccine would have a detrimental effect on her fertility, which is why she's not having it, and therefore any termination of her employment is potentially discriminatory on those grounds.
Yeah.
I think the issue there is going to be the phrase extensive research.
Yeah.
Because extensive research by someone who's not medically trained doing Google searches isn't extensive research.
Very true.
Yeah.
But you know, like to you know, by way of comparison, somebody could say, well, you know, I don't have indefinite leave to remain, I don't have jurisdiction to remain in this country, therefore they're dismissed, and they have to leave. And they can say, well, that's nationality discrimination, and it's. But you just because, you know, they hold that protected characteristic doesn't mean that you can't move forward with that dismissal, albeit that it attracts greater risk than somebody not in the same circumstances. For example, gross misconduct, and you've got a slam dunk and you've punched someone in the office, for example, the risks are different. But you know, there is still the legislation around that to allow employers to manage it. It's just a more risky dismissal. And you know, if they're subject to the legislation, if that individual hasn't been vaccinated, therefore it isn't exempt, they don't meet the statutory requirements, that you know, there's a potentially fair reason for termination there. And it's uncomfortable, isn't it? Because but it is what it is. That's how you kind of defend the discrimination. And I think that's why you'd always rely on some other substantial reason as your alternative argument in pleading the case and pleading the defence.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Emma. I think you're absolutely right, because in circumstances, and of course, I think your starting point would be it's mandatory. This is a condition. It's an absolute condition. So from the employer's perspective, you're actually on quite a solid foundation for once, provided you then, in the usual way, apply your mind and you follow a fair and reasonable process. So you've investigated matters fully. So you've got the usual scenario, but your starting point is it's compulsory. You know, it's not an opt-in or what is, you know, how should we approach this? It's if the employee can't fulfill that particular stipulation, you know, they're in difficulties. I think perhaps the nuance might be how you then consider your options. is the sort of nuclear option of termination appropriate? Is there, you know, can you move somebody from front office, back office, or could you give them something else to do? If it was, for example, going to be a temporary situation because a younger worker has not been able to queue up their vaccination because that might be indirectly discriminatory on that ground. But your starting point as an employer, I think, is quite strong because you know you're following you know, a stipulation. And the other thing I think you know, I wouldn't necessarily look to limit it. I think it goes to a trust and confidence point, possibly even a repudiatory point. It is an absolute condition. Therefore, why would you not say, well, it's both a disciplinary and it's a capability point? You know, your you know, capacity, in the sense that you're not able to perform that role. I mean, that's what, if it transpired a teacher didn't have the appropriate teaching certificate or regulatory certificate to work with youngsters, you'd pull them, you'd hook them out straight away. And of course, you've got your fallback, some other substantial reason. So again, why would you be unnecessarily restrictive? Because you've got a sort of a range of cards and you spread them out and say, well, if it's not this, it's this, and if it's not that, it's that. But actually, the cumulative effect is such, by hook or by crook, I'm sorry, you know, the end is probably going to be a termination.
Yeah.
I may well live to regret saying this, particularly as it's being recorded, but I would imagine as well that for this individual's point of view, this being introduced in an education sector is much more unlikely to happen than it being introduced in a caring role. I think particularly for primary school teachers, you know, who are teaching a whole group of people who aren't expected to be double jabbed and will be passing this backwards and forwards for years to come, and you know how active and strong the union representation is in the education sector as well. I can't foresee an environment in which this is brought in for teachers and educators, but as I say, may well live to regret having said that on a recorded session.
Yeah, I mean, but then again, perhaps given that the primary school students are probably going to be the only people in the population who aren't double jabbed, does that then make them the more vulnerable? So perhaps that would be some sort of argument. But I agree with you. I'd be surprised if this did come into the education sector, and let's hope so.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to Chris's point, with the care sector, we're taking that line because about 10 years ago, there was this whole thing with having to check passports and if it, or fraudulent NI cards, and if it was established that, you know, they didn't have the right paperwork and they couldn't furnish the right paperwork by a certain deadline, then we went down the dismissal route. And this, when you apply that analogy to this particular situation for care workers, yes, we are going to be supporting them through the 12-week period to try and get ahead of the queues and sort of, you know, get their jabs or get their exemption certificate. So there is going to be that audit trail also supporting the employee to get that paperwork in place. Or reminders being sent out to individuals who we find are just not taking this seriously enough. But I think ultimately it's got to say, you know, it's got to be a dismissal. Come 24th. So we just see which way this goes. But there is, again, that debate being had about whether it should go down the route of contravention or SOSR. So that's why I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, I'd agree with Emma, though. I think it would be a dismissal with notice rather than a gross misconduct. But
yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I know we've run over by 5 minutes. It's been really interesting. Mike, you had something to say?
Yeah, can I just ask, Sandy, obviously I know you and I know Chris. Ben, I haven't met, and Sarah, I haven't met previously. Ben, I found you online. Sarah, where do you work? Just so I can make a contact after.
Sorry, I'm at Thackeray Williams with Emma.
Ah, okay, fantastic. All right, thank you. I will drop notes to you after, if that's okay to both of you.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Please do. Yeah.
Thanks for organising this, Sandhya.
That's all right. I'm glad it's been quite interesting again. I think we'll do it in a couple of months. We might not do this in December just because it gets busy with Christmas. So if we don't see you as part of this, then have a lovely Christmas.
We're not saying that already.
Who knows? Just wanted to throw this one thing in there. We are starting the mentorship program as part of the chamber. And there is information available on the website. It's just gone up today. We are looking for established members and established business owners to come forward for mentoring. It's not expected to be very onerous. Initially, it's just going to be like a 1-hour chat with any of our new business owners or new members. So if you are interested in putting your name forward, do get in touch with Catherine, please. So you will see more information on the website. But that aside, thank you very, very much for joining. The recording will be shared with all of you and the rest of our members. And look out for our next one.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much, Sanjay.
Thanks,
very much.
Sanjay.
Take care.
Well done.
Same here. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye now.